Good afternoon. I hope I'll try to move in such a way that your lunch will not get in the way of your being able to listen and make you want to go to sleep. It happens right after lunch for me. The title of our session this afternoon is Integrating Objective Moral Virtues into Subjects. Our actual presentation is going to be a little broader than that, and it's going to be the whole question of integrating between subjects and integrating the teachings of the faith along with the moral virtues into your classroom and between your classes. Before we sort of launch into a brief introduction on that, I need to recommend two sources to you. You may have already had them recommended, but just in case, I will refer to them again, and you can find them. There are two that I would recommend just handy for the teachers. One of them is called the Penny Catechism. Okay? The Penny Catechism used to be quite popular. It is sort of self-descriptive in the sense that it's not one of the major catechisms. It's not one of the two major catechisms of the church, or even like the Baltimore and all, but it is a very fine, small catechism. And it's particularly helpful for children. Better than that, it is helpful for everyone, and so it's great to refer to it, the Penny Catechism. Now that is available in a small version. It's about like this, a little book. I couldn't find mine. But it is very small. It can be purchased just about anywhere. The better version of it, if you can find it, is the 1950s publication of it. There is a 1971 republication of it. It's fine. It has some modifications that are made that I think are just better in the 1950s version. Might have been 1958, somewhere along in there. But whatever version you find it in, it will prove to be very helpful if you want a little handbook with you. Now, if you don't, or you don't want to order it that way, it's available at least in two places online in PDF form. So you can download it from PDF, you can cut and paste, you can use it, you can run it off as you need it. So if you're looking for a place that is simple, yet is orthodox in its outlook, where you can look back and draw a particular subject matter from Revelation and from the teachings of the church, and then apply it to your students, you can look there. It's a very good, quick, safe way to do that. If you're looking for a sort of a comprehensive list of the virtues to emphasize and to discuss, I can recommend another resource. This resource is little known, but it's excellent. It's just about a 5.5-page listing of all the virtues. And it lists the moral virtues, integral parts of prudence, potential parts of prudence, vices contrary to prudence. So this is very helpful if you're teaching your students. Not only does this list of virtues go into the virtues, but it also gives you a long list of the vices of the particular vices against a particular virtue. This is, I'm going to give this copy to Charlotte, so copies may be made of this. This is copyrighted by Father Chad Ripperger, R-I-P-P-E-R-G-E-R. It can be found online. You have to work to find it a little bit, but this is Father Ripperger's list, and it's superb on the virtues and also the vices. So it's a good handy place where you can go and you can say, okay, I'm trying to have my students understand the virtue of justice. And it gives a number of different explanations, and it also gives you the vices that are contrary to it. The theological virtues, faith, hope, and love. You'll see the vices that are contrary to those particular virtues. This is a good a good one. And I'm going to hand this to Charlotte now. You can make copies of that. And these are ready sources that you can go to when you want to look back and integrate either the teachings of the Christian faith or to integrate the virtues. You want to have something ready at hand. Now, this question of, or the issue of integrating this objective moral truth into the subjects and also integrating the subjects themselves between one another. You're all pretty familiar probably, at least with the practice of it, but this whole idea of the subjects are a hallmark of modern education. They haven't always been around as they are right now. For example, you take the students and they go into a class for algebra for an hour. And then from there they go to a class in literature for an hour. And then from there they go to a class in history for an hour. I remember, by the way, I'm old enough to remember it, I also went to a rural school when I was very young. And then I moved to the big city about grade 7. And I remember being stunned at this whole idea of actually getting up and walking out of my class and walking 3 or 4 more doors over and starting another class, another subject. So the whole idea of this division, separation of subjects is really pretty new. We have a tendency in this generation, probably for the last 2 generations, of thinking that this is the way it's always been, but it's not. It has been divided up in a way that is relatively new. Now, the rationale for that, the rationale for the subject being separate and separated in instruction, separated in classes, has most often been based on the philosophy that the purpose of education is to master facts, principles, and skills in a specific content area. So remember I said yesterday that every educational approach has a philosophy behind it, the way it looks at students and then the way it transmits that by the way its processes develop. This subject, division of subjects, has been largely because the shift took place where the idea that real education takes place in specializing in subjects. Algebra, you just got to give an hour to algebra, and the students have to focus on nothing else but algebra. And so that was because of the sense that that's the best way to do it, to actually become a specialized class in a subject. Now, the schools today usually divide up, and most of you are well aware of this, the more traditional schools divide up subjects into humanities versus STEM, okay? Now, or it could be called social studies and science. Sometimes they're divided up that way. Here are the social studies courses, here are the science courses, or here's humanities, here are the STEM courses. It just depends on who's writing it and whose website you're looking at and what public school or traditional school system has it there. Humanities typically include literature, they include history, writing, et cetera, those kinds of courses. And STEM usually includes arithmetic, algebra, physics, examples like that. Now, you probably are all familiar and maybe even taught in a context where STEM was used, and you know that it's an acronym. It's an acronym for science, technology, engineering, and math. Did you know how it originated? It's relatively new. Some of you probably remember when that was the case. It originated because the modern elites, basically educators and politicians, and when I use the term elites, I'm not using it derogatorily, I'm using it as those who are charged with oversight. They're sort of the leaders in the field of education and the leaders in the field of politics. They concluded that there were just too few college students that were pursuing degrees in these fields. And as a result, since there were too few that were moving into the STEM area, it was believed that there was the necessity to start at an earlier age to direct students, young girls and young boys, into the sciences. Do you know why? Competition. It was believed that the United States couldn't be competitive enough in the future with respect to commerce and science and those kinds of things. In other words, it was believed we weren't keeping up with China and Russia and other places. Nothing wrong with the idea that we need to increase the number or at least make it more available for people if young children decide when they get older to specialize in an area. Nothing wrong with having that available. But that's essentially how it developed. The philosophy of education incorporated it because the elites in education and politics says, we don't have enough. There are not enough people going in that area. And so we really do need to start directing them when they're young to go in that area. Now notice the presupposition behind that. The presupposition is that when they're young, they need to start specializing. And that is a difference in the traditional educational approach from classical education. Essentially, the approach to classical education strives to integrate material both laterally between courses, every subject with every other subject, and vertically, every subject as it belongs to God, and also as moral virtues are reflected in those subjects. So, classical education wants to integrate, not separate into these various areas. In an integrated curriculum, the approach to mastering facts is secondary. It's not the first, it's not that it's unimportant, but it's not the most important. It is a secondary matter to making the curriculum meaningful through the integration of these subjects and problem solving and learning how to think. So the distinction is quite different between them in that way as well. When subjects are isolated from each other, like math is, or I should say, this one's going to be easier to understand. When science is separated from every other subject, they are separated from each other. Students make fewer connections. Even between subjects that fit well together. For example, history and literature. History and literature fits very well together. But when they are separated into this specialized area, what happens is students no longer make any connections between history and literature. They no longer make any connections between science and any other subject matter. Now, what happens is the students learn not to use every one of their skills in every one of their classes. It's much more of a specialized approach. Now, you might be able to conclude on your own that this particular approach has its dangers. There's nothing wrong with the subject matters themselves. But this approach to consolidating and specializing and separating the various subjects and disciplines has dangers. The dangers especially are heightened in the STEM context in that approach. The reason for that is that these divisions tend to undercut a Christian worldview. Now they don't mean to, perhaps they don't mean to, and certainly schools and teachers that use this approach don't mean to, generally speaking, but the approach itself tends to undercut a Christian worldview. It does this by teaching the students to separate knowledge from the natural world. For example, math and science, it teaches them to separate that from everything else. What immediately comes to mind that they are separated from? They're separated from morality. Now this is a good example because most everyone should be able to see it. What happens in this separated context, especially it's heightened in recent years in the STEM approach, is by moving everyone into this area, it separates it from every other area. So some students can even specialize, give all their time to STEM subjects. And what it does is it separates entirely their idea of the natural world, and you get the impression, if it's not directly taught, you get the impression that science and math And engineering and these kinds of things have nothing to do with morality. They have nothing to do with God. And that's exactly what the conclusion is in these days. In fact, you may not combine the two in any kind of, not necessarily a traditional classroom, but certainly not in a public school. Otherwise, you subject yourself to a lawsuit, potentially. And the degree to which schools do that and prohibit any kind of connection, no connections between science and morality, no connections between science and revelation, nothing. They don't have anything to do with each other, and they contradict each other. Let me give you an illustration, a personal illustration. I and a co-author have written a book, and the book is, at least the working title now, is Now and at the Hour of Our Death. And the subtitle is Making Moral Decisions at the End of Life. Now that is due back to the publisher from Editorial Matters by September 5th. So it's nearing the end of that process. Here's the reason I mention it to you. Why do you have to write a book like that? You have the Catholic faith, you have the moral teachings of the church, you have the consistent teaching of Christianity through the ages on this issue. Why do you need a book on making those moral decisions at the end of life? By the way, it's set in a question and answer format, so you can go directly to issues like euthanasia, suicide, the use of prescription medication to lessen pain, all of those kinds of questions. Here's the reason you need it. You need it because what has happened in the country and frankly in the world is that there has been such a separation educationally in these subjects, so that now there is the established view that science and medicine have nothing to do with morality, nothing to do with revelation. And that is the dominant view. So that now devout Christians may be fed constantly incorrect information through the media, through physicians, through scientists about here's what you need to do. You're in pain, just take pain medication. We can actually speed that along. In fact, if you think your life is too painful and no longer is worth living, we can make a very safe, quiet, sedate death for you, and euthanasia. And encourage people, if you really are troubled in this area, you may actually choose to end your own life, which touches on the issue of suicide. And the reason is because morality has been separated. Now, that's fairly easy for most of us to see, but what we're discussing is where it originated. It originated in the schools. It originated in the idea and the shift of the worldview of this country and the world to a more secularized, relativistic view. But then where did it go? It goes immediately into the schools. Quickly and immediately goes into the schools. So now we are two generations of people who are out there who believe that there is no connection between science and morality. No connection between medicine and morality. So you have to write a book and say, thou shalt not kill thyself. And here is how that might look. You cannot get these offers for assistance in this way, and instead, this is what you must do. So, get the book when it comes out. But it's not a encouragement to get the book. It's an illustration of why this takes place and where it leads. It's the separation and division into thinking that subjects are completely different. Now, although classical education does categorize subjects, what it does not do is it doesn't isolate them. So, does classical education talk about math? Of course. Does it talk about Western civilization, history, science? Yes, of course it does. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't isolate them one from the other. That's the difference in them. In fact, it seeks to connect them and to integrate them. Classical education also sees various ways to organize subjects in ancient sources, mostly based on types of knowledge rather than subject area. I've already mentioned that Western civilization, for example, easily does this because you can include the whole topical area of Rome and Greece and all of these area. Another is in the study of Latin and Greek. History and Western civilization naturally go together in studying those. So classical education has historically produced people who know a great deal about a variety of subjects. So it doesn't focus on making you, when you're 9 years old, a specialist in science. It doesn't do that, because the classical model is based upon the understanding that's not really the way children develop. What happens is children must be taught certain skills for learning, and then at some later date they will be very well prepared to make a selection with respect to what they want to specialize in. So it's a completely different philosophy. One pigeonholes children when they're 9 or 10 or 11 years old and separates their knowledge. The other says, no, we want you to know a great deal about the important process of learning how to think. An example of this, by the way, and you may think of them, a number of the Renaissance thinkers were people who knew a number of different things very well. Leonardo da Vinci, by the way, was an artist. Did you know he was an inventor? He invented numerous things. Well, he wasn't just one or the other. I mean, if he'd had to sign up for a STEM program, he never would have been involved in art. But he was an artist and he was an inventor. Most of you know Benjamin Franklin as a politician. Benjamin Franklin in his spare time invented bifocals. God bless him. and a lightning rod in his spare time. He was educated classically. So he was educated in how to think. What happened is he got interested in these areas, and in addition to his other work, he developed, because he could think, all these other interests. And so that's what classical education does. So the approach, or the goal of an integrated approach or curriculum, is each one of your subjects should go deep, not wide. The goal is to teach what's called in Latin multum non multas, which means much, not many in Latin. So you teach much, you don't teach many, you don't have to teach everything, scores of different things. This simply means that the goal is to teach deeply rather than broadly. That's what it means. What counts is not the number of subjects taught, and this is very important to remember. It's not the number of subjects taught, but how well students learn to think while doing them. That's what's critical.
Deep, not wide. Multum, non multas.
Much, not many.
Much, not many.
Yes, so it's not so much how well the students learn something, but how well they learn to think while they're about that subject and as they go along. Classical education uses the subjects to think teaching skills and tools of learning. Those tools of learning are things like skills of language, communication, logic, investigation, puzzle solving, and general common sense. Those are the tools of learning. You teach your children those tools of learning, and they can do anything they want to do when it comes time to specialize. That's why, by the way, test results indicate that students who segue or who are tested from a context in which this particular approach is common, which is common in classical schools and is common in many homeschools, the students do extremely well. Our children, when they took their first standardized test, had never taken a standardized test. They didn't even know what it looked like. We had to tell them, no, you have to sit and take that. And so what happens is they learn a great deal deeply, but they also learn how to think through. So there may be something they haven't taken at all, and they just apply their understanding, their common sense, their language skills, whatever it is, they apply and they do well in it. So that's the primary reason, because those who teach the classical approach don't sit down and say, okay, let's learn how to do standardized testing. They don't. They just take their kids and do standardized testing. So students have the tools of learning. They can specialize later. So keep that in mind. That's what integration is about. Now, approaches to integration, they are a multitude. We won't go into that in detail because your school, under the guidance of your headmistress, will determine the kinds of approaches to integration, how you might do it. You might do it as a school. There might be something in the year that you all will want to select as a theme, and everyone will then integrate that theme. That's one way to do it. Some schools do it that way. Many schools integrate humanities into a single class by reading classical literature. So what happens is you end up reading classical literature, but you're into history, you're into Western civilization, and you're into literature at the same time. So there's a lot of schools that do it that way. The main thing that I want to do here is to encourage you to do this, and that is communicate among yourselves. That's very important, to have regular times. It can be informal, but there may be times to get together and to discuss and communicate among yourselves. Why? So that each of you knows what's happening in the other classes, what the students are learning, what's going on in the classes. And that will help you to learn or to think about more deeply about what kind of actual questions to bring into your class, or how to support something that is being taught in a lower grade or in another class. So know what is being taught. Often that doesn't happen in schools. This separate mindset leads to teachers that are separately going about their process. Maybe doing a good job, but separate. There's no integration that is occurring. So keep in mind, the goal of education is the tools of learning, not preparing students for specialized vocations. This is way too early for that kind of thing. Now, how would an approach like this, how would it look? I'm going to give you several suggestions. I'm going to suggest how it might look at St. Patrick, and we'll be able to move through that pretty quickly, but I believe I have about 12 suggestions on how that might look. The first is there will be purpose-driven lessons. So if you want a classical school and you want to integrate, the real purpose of education has to drive every decision, every lesson. So what you will have to do is you'll have to think about your lesson plans, not just for what do I want to teach them about biology, but how do I want to integrate this? And it needs to be purpose-driven toward the final purpose of education. Lesson plan objectives are not based on what the students will be able to do, but rather on what true students will behold. Students are constantly reminded, put it in your lesson plan or for the next day. Students are constantly reminded that the good, the true, and the beautiful are real, and that they are actually a training here on earth for heaven. The approach is very different. It's not on outcome-based what you'll be able to do, but upon what the students, what truth they can come to. Number two, the second thing that will happen and how it would look at St. Patrick is there'll be an integrated curriculum. Now you've already begun that process. Some of the books that you have selected will help and aid in that. One thing that I want to say though is that every single class is a religion class. Every class. And every class is aimed at forming virtue. So, virtues, I gave you those two suggestions, and religion, every class looks to those. What does Revelation teach us about this? What do the virtues teach us? What kind of virtues do we want our children to develop as a result of studying this particular class? The study of math and science is a discovery of beauty and its rational order, for example, which ultimately is going to end up in a discovery of God. So it's easy to segue. I know some of you may be thinking, what about math and science? Math and science offers incredible opportunities for integration because everything points to the glory of God and everything points to His providential care and in creation. From a simple equation to a simple machine to behold a truth, no matter how small, leads students to the truth incarnate, the person of Jesus Christ. This integration also recognizes this person, His incarnation, as the center of human history. It's the incarnation itself. And so there will be all kinds of opportunities to integrate, and you will have that and do have that in your curriculum. Even the study of salvation and world history is always in relation to Christ and to His church. Literature, music, and art content also match the historical time period being studied. So you have all that in your curriculum already. So you have an integrated curriculum. You'll have to use it, but it's there. Number 3, there will be an Orthodox Catholicism. So in any classical school that is a Catholic classical school, there will be an emphasis on Orthodox Catholicism. Sacred Scripture and sacred tradition are integrated throughout the curriculum. Students cycle somehow, and it's basically going to be through your religion class, I realize, and that's the way it happens formally. But it also happens through your classes that there will be opportunities to deal with the 4 pillars of the Catechism, the Creed, the sacraments, morality, and prayer at a level appropriate to the development. The little children, it's going to be very simple. And when you get older, you'll be able to integrate that in a way that's appropriate for the older children. Frequent and faithful participation in the sacramental life is emphasized, especially the holy sacrifice of the Mass. That occurs here at St. Patrick. The fullness of faith is always presented in an age-appropriate manner, but is never watered down. That's important. Don't look at the catechism, the penny catechism, or anything else and put it in your own words, okay? There are places for creativity. Theology is not one of them, okay? Everything that can be said has already been said in Revelation. We might understand it in a fuller way, but don't water it down. Look at it. Make sure it's in an age-appropriate way. That's why I suggested something like the Penny Catechism, but it should never be watered down. With love and reverence, teachers introduce students to the real Jesus Christ, who both comforts the afflicted and afflicts the comfortable. So make sure that the full teaching is there. Number 4, there's always an emphasis on Western civilization. The stories of Western civilization and Christianity are so intertwined that one cannot be understood apart from the other. That is part of the problem in traditional education today, where you have such a generation that has no sense of patriotism, no sense that Western civilization is superior to other forms of civilization. That's why you have concepts like multiculturalism as an effort to somehow improve education and other things. There's certainly nothing wrong with people coming from various cultures, and there may even be a time to share information in that context. But it's never a goal for education as if it were going to make you smarter. There's nothing about embracing all other cultures that make you smarter or make you learn better or make the world a better place. Those are presumed, they're assumed, they're never proven. because that's just not the case. The fact of the matter is the Western civilization has over 3,000 years behind it. It is the civilization we have, and it is a civilization where Christianity is completely intertwined with it, and you can't understand one without the other. So make sure that you understand the reasons for something like Western civilization. Students cycle through Western civilization as part of the classical approach. Here's the reason for it ultimately. We are members of Western civilization, whether we've come here by immigration from an eastern area of the world or not. We are Western in civilization now. And because of that, we have a responsibility to preserve it. It should never be set aside, thrown aside. We have a responsibility to preserve all the good that we have been given. It is the height of hubris, of pride, for people to somehow think that whatever they come up with today is better than what has been here for 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years. Next, Latin. You always have Latin, at least. Latin studies begin in kindergarten. They're given increased emphasis in middle school and beyond. Not only does Latin provide the root words for all the modern sciences, so you learn a great deal about the sciences if you pay attention to those root words, but Latin is the language of law, politics, logic, and theology. So if you're looking for the connection of why in the world do we study Latin, it's the integrative approach. It is a key to learning all of these other areas. Not to mention the fact that it's the most precise language on earth, which aids in learning, thinking, and argument. Number 6, logic. The key to freedom and human excellence is order, particularly in thinking. So logic comes in and is very, very important. Authentic education is only possible when set free from what Pope Benedict XVI called a life of the dictatorship of relativism. And that's what we have in our country these days, a dictatorship of relativism. You can hardly believe, I should rephrase that, you can believe anything you want as long as you don't believe it's the truth, and that it contradicts false thinking. So this dictatorship of relativism is everywhere. And logic is the means to being set free by learning how to think correctly from the dictatorship of relativism. Classical education trains the mind to think orderly in all of the subjects. Focusing on English and Latin grammar is critical, so those are keys to thinking well. You might be surprised at number 7. Number 7 is poetry. A classical school integrated approach is going to have poetry integrated somehow. I'm not suggesting it has to be a separate class. In fact, probably better if it's not a separate class. But poetry is critical to the thinking skills and to irrigating the deserts and awakening wonder. Students should be reciting poetry throughout the halls of the school. So teach them poetry every chance you can. The older ones, you can teach them Shakespeare. You can teach the younger ones, but it'll be quite a while before they even pronounce it correctly. But poetry, introduce them to the works of Francis Thompson, who was one of the greatest Catholic,
Hound of Heaven?
yes, who wrote Hound of Heaven. Have them memorize that. The only reason he didn't write a lot more is he was killed in the trenches in World War I when he lifted his head up out of the trench and was shot by a sniper. But Francis Thompson, and many of them are very easy to understand and deeply meaningful. So the progressive efforts, despite them, to deny the unique cognitive benefits of memorizing poetry, internalizing the rhythmic beauty of prose awakens the mind, stocking it with new sets of language patterns. So it does all these things without you teaching them how to write poetry. Memorizing poetry is important. As I've also mentioned, it also aids in redeeming the senses. It teaches them to have affection for the things they need to have affection for and a distaste for the things they shouldn't. Number 8, primary source documents, classical literature especially. A classical school outside of math, classical education rarely needs to depend on textbooks, seldom. Now, every curriculum provides you with some working information, which is all right, but you know why you don't have to rely on the textbook so much? Because you use the original source documents. So you study trees, you're going to have some basic knowledge, but you'll go look at a tree. You will, the same is true of history, you'll look at the documents. When it comes time to talk about the Gettysburg Address, you'll read the Gettysburg Address. You don't need a book to repeat the Gettysburg Address. It's available there for you to use. So that's a characteristic of classical education and integration. Always use those primary source documents. Rather than reading secondhand accounts of history, the classical approach reads the original source when the students are ready. You don't start pre-K with the Gettysburg Address. But when they're ready, you shift them into the proper source documents. Here's an interesting question that I thought about when I was putting together my notes. How many, if you ever talk to someone about their love for literature, how many of them ever fell in love with literature by reading a textbook? You never hear about that. You know what happened with me? I had a profound conversion when I was what you call an adult convert to Christianity, because I was post age 17, was raised in an unchurched environment. And so my conversion to Christianity was late. My conversion intellectually was even later. And my conversion to Christianity, my conversion to Christianity was the greatest thing that ever happened to me, obviously. But my intellectual conversion, which happened several years later, was a wonderful thing as well. And this is how it happened. It happened because I was at a garage sale. And I was looking on a table. Now, by the way, I grew up in an area where there were two, at the time that I grew up where there were two majors in the public school system, cheerleading and football. And I've told a lot of people I didn't have the legs for cheerleading. So I played football. And I dreamt about it, loved it, until I didn't, until I hated it. And so I was your typical person who never met a book that he didn't dislike. So when I was 21 years old, I was at a garage sale, just wandered up on a garage sale, and there on a table there were several books, and I started thumbing through the books, and there was the complete works of William Shakespeare. And there was also another book, and that book was a biography of a Quaker religion professor in university. Why I was interested in those, they just piqued my attention. But those two books, the book by the Quaker religious professor, gave me a desire to learn, just introduced it to me in the same way you learn as a classical education student. You're not given this information, you see examples and you draw conclusions from their examples. And I drew conclusions about the way that he lived and thought and what he did with his life that made me think, I want to think more deeply. That's all. And then The second thing was the complete works of William Shakespeare, which awakened my soul to goodness, to truth, and to beauty. So when we talk about integration and we talk about classical literature and we talk about the original source documents, then those kinds of things are what make learning come alive for you. Those are the kinds of things that bring real conversion of intellectual life and even of the soul. Not some textbook giving you excerpts from what William Shakespeare said. Now, much of what I read I didn't even understand, but that's not the point. The point was what I did understand and the connections that I was able to make at a very early stage. Now, students are immersed in this kind of approach to education in the different worlds and wonderful worlds of everything from classical fairy tales to myth to folklore to poetry. All of these kinds of things awaken learning in them. Now, while common core standards seek to turn reading into research, that's basically what it does, our students are encouraged to delight in and engage in a great story, building up their sense of wonder and imagination. So we want to get into the stories, not to look at literature as research. Number 9, integral formation and virtue. We've talked about this a little bit, so I'm not going to go into great detail. The trend of education is what's called close reading, new criticism. I won't go into that except to say that it's a sort of a critical approach. You read and you have this sort of demystifying, deconstructive approach to literature. That is not the approach of classical education. In contrast to that, literature and classical teachers use moral criticism, which guides students through an analysis of what the text teaches about beauty, wisdom, grace, and especially virtue. So when we read a piece of literature in the classical school, we don't read it to break apart its and to criticize it in that way and to analyze it and sort of deconstruct it. We read it so that we can engage in moral criticism. What about that individual? What was he saying and thinking? Was what he was saying right or was it wrong? Why was it right and why was it wrong? So moral criticism is what we do in literature. So there's an integral formation in virtue happening all the time. Across the curriculum, throughout the stages of the whole trivium in pre-K through grade 8, students should be immersed in the Aristotelian Thomistic worldview of virtue being the key to a good life, with the grace of Jesus Christ remaining as our vital principle, pointing towards eternal life. So what happens is the basis for classical education, coming in the line of Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas, they taught that virtue is necessary to live a good life. You need it. If you have vices, you will live a bad life. If you have virtues, you will live a good life. That comes from Aristotle and St. Thomas. Well, that is enlightened and raised to a new level with the Christian faith. The life through Jesus Christ ultimately brings us to eternal life, but we can have a better life right now. Happiness can occur right now, but it is based upon the exercise of the virtues. It's possible for a person to live faithfully for Christ and to make their way to heaven, to eternal life, and yet make a lot of bad decisions along the way. And the process of classical education, especially this emphasizing and forming in virtue, helps us to develop those virtues that help us to live a good life. Number 10, greater emphasis on the arts. What's happened in the public school systems is a de-emphasis in the humanities, which essentially make us less human, because the arts are more conducive to the end for which we were created than the sciences. The imitation of beautiful art leads us to God, and nothing trains the mind to think in an orderly fashion like the study of music. I mentioned to you yesterday that music is not primarily to move the emotions, but to move us to contemplation. Certainly, a good piece may have a secondary effect on the emotions, but it's primarily to move us to contemplation. Listen when you have time, maybe on your way home. It's one of the rare modern pieces of music that I recommend. But the composer is a man by the name of Arvo, A-R-V-O, Part, P-A-R-T. I believe he was from Estonia. This piece of music was written in 1971, perhaps. It's called Spiegel im Spiegel. You know your German? It doesn't make any sense at all. I think it's mirrors in mirror or mirror in mirrors. Spiegel, S-P-I-E-G-E-L, I-M, S-P-I-E-G-E-L. Spiegel im Spiegel.
Oh, I had that so wrong. Me too. CH in there.
Pull up Arvo Part, Spiegel im Spiegel. It's about 9 minutes long. And play it when you are by yourself and listen to it and see what it does, okay? See if it does not move you. Yes, there is an emotional component, but if it does not move you to contemplation. I told my wife, Father, that I want playing before my funeral, Spiegel im Spiegel. And then I want it to go directly to Ave Maria, and then the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass. One leading to the other, because what Spiegel im Spiegel moved me to contemplation about was a sense of longing. So remember that when you listen to it. Longing.
My auto spell keep on S-P?
S-P-I-E-G-E-L. G-E-L.
Okay, Spiegel im Spiegel.
Yes.
I got it.
And when I heard that, the first sense that I had was that music creates a sense of longing. Longing to, at the hour of our death, through the Blessed Virgin Mary, to the culmination of the Holy Sacrifice and the Mass. So, when you listen to it, I've probably ruined you because I've told you what I contemplated when I listened to it.
But now we're curious. Yes.
But the point I'm making is that it moves it moves the soul somewhere. The question is where. And I suggest that it gives a constant sense of longing for something we cannot ourselves fulfill that is above us. That's it. Nine minutes of that.
Is it mostly piano or is there a horn in there?
There is cello and piano.
Oh, wow, okay.
Okay, number 11. We've already talked about this, so I'll say virtually nothing. And that is, you got to have Socratic discussion, mimetic instruction. By the way, mimetic instruction is something for a later
We had a
class.
workshop with ICLE.
Oh, did you?
Some of
Excellent.
us did.
Okay,
Well,
then you.
and some of us were
Then you've had that.
Yes.
It's basically an approach to imitation, and so that's something you want to go into in a separate class. And if you had a class in that, that's great. But
I think two of them are going to do the presentation Friday.
okay, great. Well, that's important in a classical context like St. Patrick. And then finally, what I've called technology as a means, not an end. Number 12 is a true classical school will integrate and it will use technology as a means, not an end. Classical education is not opposed to using any tool that helps achieve the learning mission, but remember the learning mission. Digital technology is one such tool that's a possibility, but its usefulness is very limited. Today, the idea is that technology is the wave of the future. You have to do everything with technology. Classical approach says no, it's actually very limited in its usefulness. In classical education, we reject the modern notion that the computer is on its way to replacing the teacher too. We also reject the movement towards what Martin Cothran of Memoria Press says, burying the students further under the modern avalanche of disordered information by handing out iPads to every student. It's a bad idea for classical education.
Advice of it, absolutely. The addiction toward it. The younger you introduce it,
The worse it gets. That's exactly right. Our focus is equipping students with an ability to order things correctly, including an ability to put science and technology at the service of man and God, not the other way around. Now, let me wrap up with this. Based on what Mrs. Hoy said, and it's certainly the case. If you didn't get it, here's my assessment of it. Everything you've been told about the glories of technology is wrong. The fact of the matter is it's very dangerous. And here's the reason for it. It has been established in actual peer-reviewed articles. If you want to find the best book that's addressed on this issue, I'm trying to think of the name of it. It'll come to me and I'll tell you. But it is a book that essentially studied the use of technology. It had been used long enough, and read the studies and concluded that the age-old assessment that there's nothing wrong with technology, it's how you use it. Isn't that what you've been told? He says that's wrong. It's wrong scientifically, it's wrong, all the studies are different. That whole idea was based on the idea that the brain was essentially firm, hard, static, those kinds of things. But the more recent studies have shown that's not true at all. The brain is very malleable. The brain is much more flexible than we would have guessed. For example, there are scores of people who have had serious brain injuries and they've come back from them. And there was a time when the conclusion was you couldn't come back at all from those. I'm not suggesting that that happens in every case, but what the studies indicate is the brain is very flexible. And so what happens is the use of technology excessively, even significantly, changes the pattern of the brain. It's not just something that is not any danger. It changes the pattern of the brain. So to make it simple, what actually occurs is the person loses the ability after a while to engage in any lengthy thought process, read any kind of books in a lengthy process. They have a difficult time doing logical syllogisms to think through things, and their attention span is about the attention span of the life of a fruit fly. Shorter maybe. And what happens is instead of, oh, I got a bad habit, what happens is the brain has been changed. And so what occurs is we are bringing students in and we're saying, oh, you need to read, you need to do this, you need to do that. But we give them iPads and all these kinds of things, and they get the iPhones given to them quickly when they're young, and their brain loses its capacity to handle the kind of education classical education gives them, where it teaches them that, okay, I have to think. Here's my premise, my major premise, here's my minor premise, here's my conclusion. My reasoning is correct because of. Well, you can't do that after a while. So be careful about the use of technology. It has a profound, established effect. You will always have people that say, oh, no, that's not true. But the fact of the matter is the evidence is sound, and it's out there now that something else takes place that's not good for us. Any questions or comments? Yes?
approach to convincing parents of that? Because for those of us that will be spending as much, if not more time with their children, like how do we effectively communicate that to these parents that have just thrown that at their kids?
You know, that is the question. I was going to say that's a really good question. That is the question. But I will suggest that you have this in other areas too. How do you convey classical education, the importance for parents to support certain kinds of things? How do you do that? Like movies and just plopping them down in front of the television, that kind of thing. So how do you do it? It is a very significant question. To answer your question pointedly, no, I haven't. I haven't thought of a way that works, that is the way to work. My suggestion would be that the school and the teachers do some collaboration, some thinking through these things. You'll be surprised what you can come up with, because you'll come up with what you've seen in your classes, what you've seen in your own children, those kinds of things. And you will, what you will do is be able to exchange these ideas and come up with communications to parents. Now, they can never be done in a way that would be offensive or talk down to them or things like that. But they'll have to be done in a winsome way, drafted, maybe letters here and there. Here's the supplement. We want you to know what your children are doing. Here's what we encourage. This is our approach to technology, and outline it and say, we recommend that you, if you have questions about this, that you read the following book, and which will come to me in a moment. But they often will not. Most often will not, but some parents will. It's just like all your kids won't just take to this immediately. But I think consistent wordsmithing and communicating, and the parish doing that. Actually, that's an important part of formation in the parish too. Mm-hmm. To start saying, you know, you're ruining yourself to understand the holy sacrifice of the Mass. My goodness, you can't stand a moment's silence anymore. You're always in a hurry. You've got to have action, so it affects us in other ways. So an educational process to parents, slowly but regularly, I think, to encourage them. And some will get it. They'll start struggling at home. It's going to be tough because they will have already opened the door to that. But I would suggest one of the places to start is with the teachers. See, we have to be very careful. And if for no other reason, that if you are concerned about this, then you can read this book that I will recommend to you, and you'll see that it is a very significant danger, which I'm going to try to look up right now. Go ahead. Did you have something to add to that?
I was part of a classical Catholic cooperative in Austin for a few years, and they incorporated at least a semester where they considered it a colloquium evening, where the teachers and those on board that understood the mission strategically planned an evening where they divided up the time to where there was somebody in with the children and helping form and helping them spread the message to them, and then there was an education forming aspect for the parents as well, and it was a requirement. And the families that came through that cooperative, there were over 30 families in the Austin area, and they drove from over an hour and a half away. That's where we were so heavily formed, and it was through much of those colloquium evenings. And I know it's a lot of work, but it was a beautiful thing.
That's an idea, Charlotte and Father, that to do during the year, where you have the parents. I know it's not possible to put that up front to all the parents now, because you have kids who are registered. But in the future, start that where you do want to require it and say, hey, this is very important, because we want you to know what we're doing, and we want to support you. We want you to support the school, and to implement something like that in the future.
Protect the culture of the school.
That's a good point. Remind me of that when I tell you this. The book, written by Nicholas Carr. It's called What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains. It's the shallows. It's called The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, by Nicholas Carr. It's a New York Times bestseller. It's several years back. I've read it a couple of times. I was unnerved by it. So back to what was just mentioned. I think one of the things that's very important, very good, is for you to continue to develop the culture of the school. What is the culture of the school? What's it going to look like? What does it stand for? Not just its education, but what is if we brought a visitor in, and the visitor spent 2 or 3 hours with us, what would the visitor conclude about the culture of the school? That's one way to do it. I'll give you an example. My first introduction to a fine classical schoolroom, I may have mentioned this to some of you. I was taken around by the headmaster and we walked into the first classroom. I walked into the back of the classroom, all the students' desks, about 30 children. All the students' backs were to me. When the door was open, a student looked around and saw it was the headmaster and me, and that student, I forget what the student said, but they all popped up immediately. They stood up. The headmaster then introduced me to the teacher. And the teacher then said something to the effect of, would you like to recite something for our guests? And they did. They then, I forget what it was. I was so impressed with the whole approach. And so they made a recitation because the kids love to do that kind of thing. These looked like they were 9, 10 years old. And so they do that, and the headmaster praised them. I clapped and all thanked them, and we left. They sat back down as we left. Now, there were other things that stood out to me, but I've never forgotten that. That was over 20-something years ago. And it was, if I was called upon to mention the culture, I would draw several things. Respect, the teacher's role as the head of that, respect for elders. There were a number of things that I would draw. So scores of things that, and again, this is probably a discussion, all of you together, what's the culture look like? And then you transmit that to the parents. Here's our culture, this is what we do. And that's why we have the colloquium, because our culture is very important. And for your child to be successful, and for you, it's important that you understand what we're about. It's our culture. Anything else? No one else?